a battle unlike anything the world had ever seen fought across endless desert expanses, is the dream of every elite warrior. A place where state-of-the-art instruments of war can unleash their full fury under the command of some of the finest military minds in human history. Yes, we are talking about the Battle of El Alamein, where the professional forces of the British Army faced off against the battle-hardened fanatical troops of the Axis. So without further delay, let's turn back the clock and immerse ourselves in one of the most heroic chapters of the most brutal war in history in today's video. As in our video about the uselessness of the Italian fascists, which we've linked down in the description, the Allies, spearheaded by the forces fighting under the Royal British flag, launched a spectacular assault and victory against an enemy whose numbers dwarfed their own. The number of enemy soldiers captured in that battle is said to have been nearly 3.5 times the number of British troops taking part in the assault. But don't worry too much about the fate of these poor men, because Erwin Rommel has received the news and is already on his way to rescue them. As it turned out, the general who had made his name in the French campaign did not disappoint either the Italian prisoners or Hitler himself. The German troops under his command, built around the Afrika Korps that had just entered the fray since June 1942, launched a series of flanking thrusts swinging through the south to smash into the British armored defenses and inflicting heavy losses on the 8th Army. At this point, the British under Middle East Commander-in-Chief Claude Auchinleck mounted a surprisingly clumsy defense and continually surrendered key tactical positions to the enemy. Riding these victories, the Germans pushed forward and encircled the British forces there. After 9 months of fierce resistance under 2 sieges, Tobruk finally fell. Rommel scooped up a haul of 33,000 prisoners, along with 30 tanks, 2,000 vehicles, 5,000 tons of food supplies, and 2,000 tons of fodder. The fall of Tobruk, together with a string of defeats in the Battle of Gazala and the subsequent clash at Mersa Matruh, dealt a heavy blow to the prestige of the British armed forces. On the other side of the lines, the sweeping victories of the Afrika Korps propelled Rommel's name straight into the ranks of the greatest commanders of the modern age, along with the nickname, the Desert Fox. By June 1942, he was officially promoted to Field Marshal. It is worth noting that the Nazi regime had another general who was also promoted to Field Marshal in 1942, a man many consider even more brilliant than Rommel. And that brings us to a little quiz that military knowledge would like to put to you in today's video. In your opinion, which of the 4 options below is the name of the general we just mentioned? Option A, Erich von Manstein. Option B, Friedrich Paulus. Option C, Hermann Göring. Option D, Walter Model. Time's up. Leave your answer down in the comments and stay with us until the end of the video to find out. Back to the story. Though he had been promoted to Field Marshal, it was still far too early for Rommel to celebrate, as shortages of fuel and ammunition in his army were already becoming critical. Meanwhile, on the other side of the line, the remaining British troops, despite struggling after the loss of their main supply route, were, thanks to strong support from the rear and equipment aid from the United States, now ready for a rematch to drive the Germans off the North African front. Despite the fact that several British headquarters around Cairo in Egypt, only about 800 kilometers from Tobruk, had fallen into a state of utter panic, one thing was clear: whatever happened, they had to stop the Afrika Korps, which was now advancing toward the Allies' strategic position at the Suez Canal. The next battle, which would decide the future of the Commonwealth, would take place at El Alamein, a small railway station near the Mediterranean Sea, 96 kilometers west of the British naval base at Alexandria. Around this position, Commonwealth forces had built a chain of bunkers, shelters, minefields, and barbed wire to reinforce the main defensive line at the Qattara Depression, 32 kilometers further to the south. Although the area around El Alamein was mostly desert just 16 kilometers away, the low Ruweisat ridge could be used as a perfect natural observation post, allowing commanding officers to survey an immense stretch of the desert. Middle East Commander-in-Chief Auchinleck was counting on the soft ground of the Qattara Depression to limit mobility, the very factor considered the absolute advantage of the Afrika Korps. And if Rommel wanted to swing wide around the depression again to strike deep into the Commonwealth lines, as he had done before, the Germans would very likely face shortages of equipment, gear, food, and water, as their supply lines would be stretched thin and far easier to attack and cut. But despite the grave danger looming ahead at exactly 3 a.m. on 1st July 1942, Rommel officially launched his attack. However, after unexpectedly running into a sandstorm, the 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions of the Afrika Korps were delayed and suffered no small amount of severe losses. Not until 10 a.m. that same day did the 21st Panzer Division finally draw near the Ruweisat Ridge. Immediately, the Indian Infantry Brigade stationed there, supported only by a few dozen howitzers, anti-tank guns, and 9 Matilda tanks, found itself at a clear disadvantage. Yet thanks to their incredibly stubborn resistance, they still managed to bog the Germans down. Meanwhile, the 15th Panzer Division of the Afrika Korps had to face Britain's 1st Armored Division, a far more elite force newly deployed to reinforce the defensive line around Ruweisat. After a hard-fought clash with no clear winner, both of these top-tier divisions on either side were forced to withdraw, having lost several dozen tanks. In this way, only the 90th Mobile Infantry Division made any significant advance, but it too was pounded by artillery from 3 South African brigades and failed to push deeper into the British lines. Despite the risk of becoming mired the very next day, 2nd July, Rommel launched yet another attack. But this time, the 90th Mobile Infantry Division could no longer repeat its performance from the day before. After suffering considerable losses under the enemy's defensive artillery fire, it was thrown back from the southern route and forced to shift its attacks eastward toward the Ruweisat area, in coordination with the 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions. By this point, however, the British in this sector had established a relatively solid defensive line, with only a field artillery regiment, an anti-aircraft regiment, and a mixed infantry company. The defenders there, though still somewhat clumsy in their coordination, managed to hold out long enough for Britain's 4th Armored Brigade to arrive striking directly at the 15th Panzer Division. At the same time, the remaining 21st Panzer Division of the Afrika Korps was intercepted by the British 22nd Armored Brigade. The two sides fought on until late into the night. British units from the surrounding defensive positions were continually sent in to reinforce the Ruweisat Ridge. The following morning, seeing that the defensive positions around Ruweisat were no longer in immediate danger, General Auchinleck ordered British forces to counterattack the Axis positions around El Alamein, prioritizing those sectors with large concentrations of Italian troops as top targets. On 5th July 2nd, New Zealand Division was tasked with advancing straight toward El Marais to wipe out the entire rear elements of the Ariete Division. However, they failed, having run into intense fire from an Italian motorized division sent in as reinforcement. By this point, the overall situation on the battlefield in the First Battle of El Alamein was essentially decided. Even though both sides continued to launch counterattacks, interspersed with defensive actions and force consolidation at Tel El Eisa, the Midiraya Ridge, and the Ruweisat area, the Axis, despite making a few local gains, still could not break through. As for the Allies, with more than 13,250 killed and wounded out of a total of 150,000 troops, they had yet to secure a clear advantage over the Axis. But at the very least, they had brought Rommel's entire army to a halt. However, by the end of July, Axis forces were still only 106 kilometers from Alexandria, close enough to threaten major population centers and the Suez Canal under British control. To secure the defensive positions at El Alamein, the British arranged a network of interlocking strongpoints wrapped around the entire front line. In theory, the Germans could regain the advantage by turning these defensive positions into meat grinders, or so-called devil's gardens, forcing Britain's main force to bleed out to the point of no recovery, and only then launching a counteroffensive. But overall, the advantage still lay with the Allies. No longer under serious immediate threat, they had the chance to rebuild their strength and bring in more equipment. Alongside their domestically produced tanks, like the Valentine Matilda and Crusader, they were also reinforced with a substantial number of heavy weapons, such as M3 tanks and various modern artillery pieces. Along with this, there was also a change in the British command. However, General William Gott did not even live to formally take over, as his plane was shot down by two German Luftwaffe Messerschmitt Bf-109s while he was returning to Cairo from the front. With no other choice, British hopes had to be placed on the shoulders of a small, unimposing man, Bernard Montgomery, who would later be remembered as one of the greatest military commanders in British history. But before he could taste any of that glory, he first had to defeat the German units still burning with momentum at El Alamein. In stark contrast to Rommel's reckless offensive style, Montgomery was extremely cautious and would usually wait until his army had the best possible manpower and equipment before launching an attack against the elite formations of the Afrika Korps. On his side of the battlefield, Montgomery confidently told his men, "I have canceled the withdrawal plan. If we are attacked, there will be no retreat. If we cannot live here, then we will die here." Before the battle, Churchill himself came to visit and encourage the British soldiers. Drawing on his own experience after a heart attack, the venerable Prime Minister shared his secret for staying in good condition, drink alcohol, smoke, and above all, don't exercise. By 23rd of October 1942, after 6 weeks of frantic buildup, both sides officially stepped into the Second Battle of El Alamein. At the opening of the fight, Australia's 24th Brigade struck first, pinning down Nazi Germany's 15th Panzer Division. By 9:40 p.m., thousands of British guns of all calibers unleashed a 20-minute hurricane of fire on the Axis defensive belts. After that, under cover and diversion from artillery armor and air units, British engineers threw themselves into clearing the Germans' deadly mines. As for the anti-tank mines, before British engineers could properly remove them, infantrymen could stomp on them a few times to pack the sand and then calmly walk straight across without worrying about being blown to pieces, because the body weight of an ordinary man was simply not enough to trigger the fuse of an anti-tank mine. But it was a different story with the small frog anti-personnel mines. They were carefully concealed beneath the desert sand. Just one careless step, and after a sharp click came an explosion that tore a soldier's body apart the instant he lifted his foot. Because the minefields around the Devil's Garden were so deep and wide, the mission to neutralize the garden completely failed. But that still did not stop the British advance. A series of small feint attacks was carried out, scattering Axis formations. By around 10 p.m., 4 Commonwealth infantry divisions launched their main assault, driving straight at the center of the Axis defenses. Ahead of them, engineer units were working to clear the anti-tank mines, so that by 2 a.m., the first 500 Allied tanks could begin to move forward. However, just 2 hours later, tanks running into mines churned up so much dust and sand that the infantry following behind could no longer see their way. At this point, Britain's 7th Armored Division, assisted by a brigade of Free French forces, attacked the positions of Germany's 22nd 21st Panzer Division and Italy's Ariete Division, but was met with ferocious counterattacks. Realizing they were being hammered by relentless Allied blows and risked being cut off, the Germans threw in the 185th Parachute Brigade and 2 elite infantry divisions, striking back with everything they had into the eastern flank of the Allied line. While the battle on the ground raged with full fury, a squadron of 6 Wellington bombers backed by 20 British Avro Anson biplanes suddenly took off into the night, flying low and fast, straight at the enemy artillery positions. Even so, that still wasn't enough to break the stalemate for the Allied infantry pinned down below. By dawn on 24 October 1942, not a single Allied tank had yet broken through the Germans' double minefield, and the Axis still seemed capable of holding out against another assault. However, the Allies had seized positions very close to the Axis lines and kept pounding them with artillery. The barrages were so intense that one German general collapsed and died from stress right there on his patrol. This brief paralysis on the Axis side gave Montgomery just enough breathing space to reassess the situation and prepare a new all-out offensive. While waiting for the engineers to continue clearing mines and opening routes for the tanks to advance, the Allied air forces launched more than 1,000 bombing sorties against the enemy's defensive lines, severely limiting the ability of German-Italian units to counterattack. However, by 6 p.m., seeing that the British 51st Division was pinned down and unable to achieve a breakthrough, the Axis sent in the German 15th Panzer Division and Italy's Littorio Infantry Division to strike directly at Britain's 1st Armored Division in an effort to retake a ridge on the northern sector of the line. The two sides fought each other to a standstill, creating the largest tank battle of El Alamein. A few hours later, the Allied 10th Armored Division launched an attack on the nearby Deir el-Munasib area, but again ran into ferocious resistance. The worst situation befell the British 8th Armored Brigade. Just as they were trying to clear mines and open a path, they were hit repeatedly by Axis bombers. Then, just when they had barely managed to reform their ranks at dawn, they were pummeled once more by enemy artillery. The fighting temporarily paused on Sunday, 25th October, ending in a stalemate between the two sides. Realizing they could not simply go on holding the line forever at first light the next day, 26th October, Germany's 15th Panzer Division and Italy's Littorio Division launched a probing attack to search for weak spots in the Allied defenses, but suffered a crushing defeat. Late in the afternoon, the Allies opened yet another offensive. The British 51st Division alone launched 3 separate assaults on Kidney Valley, but in the darkness, the British troops lost track of their own positions, turning the attack into a chaotic and ineffective push. Meanwhile, the Australian assault proved far more effective. After just a few hours of fighting, they managed to seize a German artillery observation post south of Tel El Eisa, north of El Alamein. By late noon, a brigade of Gurkha troops supported by artillery and 30 tanks from Britain's 40th Royal Armoured Division engaged in fierce combat with Germany's 164th Light Infantry Division and successfully captured the last strong point in that sector. Further south, the Greek Brigade, though not as elite as the British regulars, fought with remarkable courage, shielding British tanks as they pushed into German defensive lines. However, faced with the enemy's solid fortifications, their attack still failed, and they suffered heavy casualties. At this point, Rommel, possibly still weakened after his period of convalescence, returned to personally take command of the Afrika Korps, despite the grim situation. Taking in the battlefield at a glance, he quickly grasped Montgomery's tactics in the north and ordered the 15th Panzer Division, the 164th Division, and several Italian units to launch a direct assault on the Allied forces at Point 29, but the attack failed under constant harassment from Allied artillery and aircraft. Right then, something very rare throughout the entire Second World War happened. Italian infantry units bravely pushed through curtains of artillery and tank fire, closing in for face-to-face combat with the Allies and forcing them to pull back from several positions in Kidney Valley. British tanks that moved up were driven back by Axis anti-tank guns. In London, upon hearing the news, Prime Minister Churchill cried out, "Is it really so hard to find a general who knows how to fight a battle to face them?" At some defensive positions, the Germans even depressed the barrels of their 88mm flak anti-aircraft guns and sent a few tanks forward as bait. When British tanks rolled into the ideal killing zone, the pre-sighted anti-aircraft guns opened fire, shattering even the heaviest tanks. The brutal fighting continued. The British, though they captured several more outposts, still could not gain a decisive advantage. For the Germans, however, the situation was far worse. Not only had some of their elite units been siphoned off to the Eastern Front, but Rommel was also struggling because the convoys carrying fuel and essential supplies for the Afrika Korps were being savaged. By the final days of October 1942, almost all sources of supply for Rommel's army had been exhausted. At this point, he did not want to, but was forced to commit his last elite reserve, the 90th Light Infantry Division, into the fight. Montgomery, on receiving this news, immediately ordered intensified attacks further to the south step by step, forcing Axis troops to contract into their final defensive lines at Tel El Akakir and Kidney Valley. The final exchanges of fire between the two sides began. The 90th Light Infantry Division surged forward to attack the Australians, but was hammered so relentlessly by artillery that it had to withdraw without achieving any success. By 28 October, the 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions made a desperate attempt to attack the British, only to be driven back in a truly disastrous state. By the afternoon, these two divisions planned to attack once more, but were bombed so heavily by Allied aircraft that they could not even reform their lines. At this point, the strongest German units had been virtually shattered. On top of that, the remnants were being steadily worn down by continuous attacks from the various formations of the British Commonwealth. Seizing the moment at 1 a.m. on 2nd November, Montgomery decided to launch an all-out assault. To open the blow, he ordered the Air Force to bomb the remaining German infrastructure. This was followed by an attack by the 2nd New Zealand Division together with British Infantry Brigades 100 133 and 151, all supported by the British 9th Armoured Brigade, newly moved up from the El Alamein rail station. The German line, defending in a state of desperation, threw every anti-tank weapon they had into the fight in an effort to hold back the advancing wave of British armor, yet still managed to destroy nearly 1/3 of the 9th Armored Brigade's remaining strength. By 11 a.m. on 2nd November, the remnants of the 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions and the Littorio Division had been defeated, and most of the remaining German and Italian tanks had been destroyed. The situation had become utterly dire. On 4th November, Rommel was forced to order a general retreat along the entire front, defying Hitler's command to hold your positions. As they withdrew, Rommel had the roads destroyed and mines laid to slow the Allied advance, while positioning Italian units in the rear and giving priority to the evacuation of German troops. Once again, the Italians fought to the last bullet, there surrendering only when they had completely run out of ammunition. On 11 December 1942, in a final act of desperation, the Germans dared to launch one last blow against the pursuing Allies, inflicting heavy casualties, then continued to fall back toward the last Axis lines in North Africa. At this point, El Alamein had ended in a devastating defeat for the Axis, with more than 10,000 killed and wounded, and at the cost of over 13,000 Allied casualties. According to some experts at El Alamein, as in many other battles, the German army was always defeated under the crushing weight of overwhelming enemy strength, while the combat effectiveness of their Italian allies could do little to change the outcome. So what is your view of this battle? Let us know down in the comments. And as for the promised answer from the show, it is option A, Erich von Manstein.